Welcome to the Divine Council Worldview podcast. Again, it's good to have you with us. Today, we're going to be talking about the meaning of God in the New Testament. And the reason we're doing it here, this is kind of, if you've been following with us in our podcasts, we have just finished the book of Genesis, a verse by verse or topic by topic conversation through that book. And purposely, we wanted to get to John, because Mike, Dr. Heiser never got to it in his podcast. And so B, it's a beautiful transition from the Old Testament into the New, and especially the opening line in the beginning. The reader is invited to, as it were, revisit the book of Genesis through the opening line of John. And so I think it's a nice it's a fine decision that you and I have made, Mike, to go into the book of John and to see how it accords again with the Divine Council Worldview podcast. So, welcome back. How have you been this last couple of weeks?
It's been good. By this point in time, we've now transitioned into a new year, and I'm getting ready for another new year for the Lunar New Year. So it's going to be an interesting couple of weeks.
Yeah, something I've never lived by that. So I it's all new to me. But all right, what I'd like to do is let's just get into it. And again, in the back of my mind, and teachers always think this way, preachers I suppose do as well, that you wish your audience had been with you in previous discussions so that you can keep moving a conversation forward. And when it comes to the meaning of Elohim in the Old Testament, we've been through that a lot together in Genesis. Now we move into the New Testament where the word Theos comes into play, the Greek word Theos. And so I think it's worth a whole podcast to talk about that transition between the Old and New, Hebrew and Greek, when it comes to the concept of divine being. So I'm just going to work through some points. And Mike, as always, I'm throwing this at you for the first time. So I welcome your responses to it, and I always enjoy it. So let's go from here. We could also say, and I would even say that the way to look at this is thinking in terms of a path from Old Testament Elohim to New Testament Theos. It is a path. There's a time element. There's a geographic element. There's a theological element passing. There's a lexical, element passing between these two languages and their description of the divine world. So I'm going to number my points, and I do that just for the sake of moving us through a conversation. So I'll just start with what I would call number one. And again, these are just my own thoughts as I think, think into this podcast and how I want to outline the idea of a movement of the Old Testament concept of Elohim into the New Testament concept of Theos. Number one, in the Old Testament, and this is review. If you've been with us or you have been part of a Divine Council Worldview conversation in your own past as a listener, I hope the first several points I make here are kind of I know that, and that's good. I'm just trying to catch everyone up to where we need to be. In the Old Testament, Israelites used the Hebrew word Elohim to denote any personal being presumed to exist in the heavens, and by that we mean up in the sky or in the stars or up there kind of thing. It's a location to them, and that was, of course, symbolic to some degree, but that's kind of how they thought of it. Other cultures use similar terms in referring to their deities. So Hebrew had Elohim, Ugaritic had the word Il, plural Elim. Phoenicians called their deity Il. An Aramaic person would say, or a person who spoke Aramaic would use the word Elah. Elohim would be the plural. And in Akkadian, the deity was called Elu. Now, the point is, as you hear those words, you notice that Hebrew didn't invent the word Elohim. It borrowed it. It just simply assumed the cultural norm for how to speak of a divine being. So therefore, in terms of general discussion, it appears that people of the ancient world used very similar words. God did not invent a term, in other words, in the Bible, called Elohim. It's simply using a familiar term for all divine beings. Okay, so far so good, Mike. Anything you want to add to that?
I mean, I think one thing that it will be helpful for them to realize is that a lot of these languages, like you mentioned, Ugaritic, they're all Semitic languages. So in other words, they're cousin languages to Hebrew. And so there is going to be a similar sound and cadence to the words. And even the words like the Aramaic one that you mentioned, Elah, that's even used in books like Job, where like there's bits of borrowing where the words themselves are essentially transliterated into Hebrew too. And so we can see there is a little bit of a cultural exchange that's happening.
Right. I like that. Cultural exchange, especially not just in language, but in meaning. Right.
Yeah.
All right. Go ahead.
There was also this very interesting thing that I found in the dictionary of deities and demons in the Bible. And this is one of those primary resources that Dr. Heiser had always would refer back to. I think I even recall him saying that he actually read that book from cover to cover.
Oh, did he really? Well, it sounds like mine.
Which is, anyways, it's incredible. It's a really thick book. It's a reference book. You can still even purchase it now from Brill because they're reprinting it, so people don't have to pay the extravagant prices they see on eBay. But there was a very interesting line they have here about the word Elohim. It mentions here the main cultures surrounding ancient Israel have each developed special vocabs for the notion of deity. Though these words are currently rendered as God by modern translators, it should not be assumed that the ancient Near Eastern conceptions of God are in perfect correspondence with those of modern people. It is therefore essential not to stop short at the mere translation of the term, but to probe their significance and connotations by a careful study of the way and context in which they have been used. I mean, this is essentially a very scholarly or academic way of describing what you and I have been doing throughout the whole entire Genesis series. Like every time we saw the word Elohim, we paused and just simply took a moment of considering the context of what's even happening. And so that's simply all that we're simply saying. And, when folks have tried to point out that, oh, Dr. Heiser is a polytheist or he doesn't worship Yahweh alone, this is just he was expressing simply what was going on culturally in the context. And what we have been doing throughout Genesis is just simply pointing out that the word Elohim is not a special word, like you said. It's a common word that was used by different cultures. And the Hebrews simply took that in as part of the whole entire cultural exchange amongst their neighbors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. Great, thank you. Yeah, number 2, let's just keep moving from what you're saying there. We can keep moving. Again, this is the path that we are moving from the old into the new. In the Old Testament, then, the meaning of Elohim was quite stable and consistent. It becomes common to hear, and I love to collect passages like this where you have to use your computer to find this phrase, Elohim and not man, man and not Elohim. That becomes like the bookends of existence. And so you'll hear this rhetorical way of describing two essentially separate modes of personal existence. Numbers 23:19. I'm God, not man. I'm El, not Ish, is the Hebrew. 1 Chronicles 29:1. The temple is not for man, Adam, but for God, for Elohim. 2 Chronicles 14. You are our Elohim. Let not Enosh or man, be my enemy. It just has that back and forth. It's very common. Again, if you just type it into your word search on your computer for your Bible, God and not man, that kind of idea. I like Hebrews or Hosea 11:9. I am Elohim and not Ish. It's God's way of saying I'm not you. Notice, by the way, and we've been through this, nowhere do angels come into that back and forth, because angels are Elohim. Therefore, the idea of I'm Elohim and not man, you wouldn't expect ever, and never do you get a angel or a malach in that kind of a back and forth conversation. So, and what's interesting,
Ron, would it be fair to say, I know some folks still get hanged up about the word angel or malach. I remember in Dr. Heiser's Angels book, he tried to clarify that the word angelos and malach, they describe a job. They're essentially a job title. They're not right. They're not describing ontology or basically the species or the category, or like the type of being it is, but it's simply that it's a job title, such as I'm still a human being, but I was a computer engineer.
Yeah, there you go.
We don't say computer engineers are a special species. That's a job title. That's a profession that I went into.
It's one of the most overlooked ideas in all of theology, and you can find most books. In fact, when I go to a used bookstore and I come to the angel section, I've probably said this over our times together, I skip it. The angel section in a used bookstore is not worth your time, because what they're doing in almost every book you read is they're looking up the word angel. So it becomes worthless in that sense. Notice my last point on this second point. Think of this, and this is so important to catch in the distinction or the path from Elohim to Theos, that humans, even miracle-working humans, are never considered to be an Elohim. So you have, like in the Exodus 7 story, I will make you Elohim to Pharaoh. And yet at the same time, Moses walks into Pharaoh, and he talks about being sent by Yahweh. In other words, he's not Yahweh, but he is going to be doing these miracles. And in fact, in 8:19, Exodus, when the magicians see what Moses does, or Aaron, specifically in creating lice, they say, this is the finger of Elohim. They don't look at Aaron and say, he must be an Elohim. They always attribute it to the God of, or the Elohim of the person doing the work. 1 Kings 18, very famous story of Elijah calling down fire from heaven. Nobody says Elijah's an Elohim. In Daniel 3:28, after they come out of the fiery furnace, Nebuchadnezzar admits the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did this. He doesn't think they are Elohim. Same with the lion's den in 6:23. So, key point. Remember this going forward into the New Testament. In the Old Testament, no one ever mistakes an Elohim for an Adam. They seem to be very separate, essentially separate modes of personal existence. And can an Elohim come and do a malach in front of you? Can you hear someone talk to you and realize, as Abraham probably did and Jacob probably did, that this being is divine? Yes, that happens, but that's where the concept of a malach or a messenger comes into play. In the New Testament, I'm going to, as many people can think ahead on me now, you're not going to have that same kind of interplay. There's going to be something else going on. So it's important to catch in this path or this movement between the two worlds of the old and new, that the old does not give us people showing up or doing a miracle and then someone saying, you must be an Elohim. So,
well, Ron, I think we also have to preference it when you have there in humans, you're talking about living human beings, right? We're not talking about like those that have deceased or who have like passed away, right? We're talking about living, embodied human beings walking and still having blood pumping through their veins kind of human beings. And I think that's something to just the kind of preference, because some people will, like I'm thinking of like the incident of the Hohentar moment with Samuel and the medium at Endor. That Dr. Heiser, he took that as Samuel was actually there, but he was no longer alive. Okay, and thus why the word Elohim that is applied there could apply to Samuel at that moment, because he had already died according to the narrative.
Yeah, Mike and I talked about that and whether or not that qualified. For me, it didn't, but it's I'm certainly going to let Mike have his view on that one. So
yeah,
in my mind, she didn't know what she saw. She just screamed and said, "That's an Elohim." But whether she knew it was Samuel, that's another discussion for me. So
yeah. And the Exodus 7 one, I remember having a question asked, sent to me about that once. And it's a funny passage when you look at it, because that whole entire moment is as well as Moses is trying to wiggle his way out of being called as a prophet of God. And thus eventually God brings Aaron into the picture and creates almost this whole entire scenario where you're my prophet, but because you're trying to wiggle yourself out of this way, I'm basically going to present you, Moses, as though you're God. Aaron is now the prophet to you, and you're all presenting this information before Pharaoh. It's a humorous moment, and it's not to be taken that literally at that moment Moses was made into a god. Right.
7:1.
It's all about parody, and God basically just trying to like, Moses, stop this. Stop trying to get out of the job.
to some people, 7-1 is a reason to say that Elohim can be a human. And I don't take it that way. I take the shock value of 7-1, Exodus, to be that when you walk into that room, Pharaoh's got to understand you're talking for me. You are my representative, my agent. So you are going to be to him Elohim. But and the key to that is later in the chapter when Moses doesn't claim to be Elohim. He doesn't claim to be Yahweh. He claims to be sent by Yahweh. So Moses knew he was not an Elohim. And I think that's important to be seen.
I mean, he clarifies that, but I think just even when you look at the narrative of how God is basically doing like a parallel relationship, like God is to Moses as Moses is to Aaron. Like there's that parallel that's happening in that passage. And so we're not meant to take that as just reading that in isolation. That's dangerous when you're not even noticing the parallelism that God is doing between him and Moses and then Moses to Aaron, that the relationship, the parallel is the relationship of what they are to one another.
Yeah, well said.
Moses is to speak for God, while Aaron is to speak for Moses, and that's what's happening in that passage.
Yeah.
And so, it's just kind of what happens when people proof text.
Yeah, and we all do it at times. All right, so number 3 then on our path from Elohim to Theos, and again, this is review for many of us. Old Testament monotheism was committed to the belief that one Elohim was categorically and permanently different from all other Elohim. So we would say belief in one God in English. What we're doing is that's a matter of comparison, not a matter of the lexicon, because the word God, again, that's the trick. Yahweh was then, we'd say, a unique or the unique Elohim, the creator, the sustainer of all reality. And so you had no dualism in Israelite religion. And when I say religion, I mean the people who knew God, were committed to him like a David. He never saw anything happen outside of the power and the authority, and maybe we could say the permission of his deity, but he was committed to a world that was run by Yahweh, shall we say. And created, and this is interesting, again, to anybody who reads the Old Testament, created Elohim could be teased as nothings, quote, in Isaiah 41:24, because by comparison to Yahweh, they're nothing, like a mouse to an elephant, right? So they exhibited no real power. They were nothings in the rhetorical notion of Isaiah. However, earlier in Isaiah, chapter 40, verse 17, we'd already heard the word nothing used for the nations. So again, nothing does not mean they don't exist. It means that they, by comparison, have no power when thought of in terms of Yahweh. And yet Elohim were very real. And so again, this is all, I trust, review for those who have been with us, but that's so important to catch when we move into the New Testament concept of a Theos and how the Theos of the New Testament will play off the idea of the Elohim of the Old Testament very closely. Okay. Number 4 in our move, and we've been through this again, placing a capital G on any God in the Bible is therefore problematic, or at least for those intending to read the Bible with its original force. If you want to know how the Bible sounded to the writer and reader, take all capital letters off. Better to let the text answer which Elohim. In almost every story, you have some kind of a notion, at least the ones we've seen that we picked up on in Genesis, for example, the Elohim who, and you get that in 35:1 of Genesis, and 48:5, Jacob talks about the Elohim who took care of him all his life. In the Psalms, the Elohim, Psalm 59:17, the Elohim who shows me steadfast love. Isn't that beautiful? Psalm 77:14, you are the Elohim who works wonders. Again, compared to what he was seeing among other deities. Daniel 3:15, who is the God who will deliver you? Remember, then Nebuchadnezzar said it that way. The reason we, and I throw this in now because Acts 17:24 is the only time, and the ESV beats the New King James on this one. It reads, the God who made the world. And I love that because the Old King James and the New King James and probably many other versions just go with God who made the world. No, the story that Paul's telling in Acts 17, especially as it's recorded for us in Greek, he says, the Theos who made the world. So he's working with a polytheistic audience. And he picks up the word theos, which is the word they will use, but then he has to clarify which one he's talking about. And it's a beautiful vision into their worldview at that moment when he says, the Theos who made the world. So as I've said before, to you, Mike, and here we go again, it's unfortunate that the English word God has come to have a very different meaning than the word God, capital G versus small g. When I say God with a capital G, people smile. When you say God with a small g, people wince. And that's unfortunate because we only have ourselves to blame on this. These are the same word in Hebrew. And here's where we're going, of course. When you get to the New Testament, it's going to be the same word again. Theos does not have a capital T on it. And so we have to work with the which Theos question now. Moving forward on every conversation, we can't presume that Theos is going to have a capital T in any one location. So,
if I can add here, because even from the beginning when we started doing the podcast recording, I think I had said this line, and I do agree with you that we have ourselves to blame, because in Western society, in many ways, the battle of the gods or the worship of gods in Europe, especially, Christianity won that battle. In large, wide majority culture, when people started using the word God, it became a shortcut reference to the God of the Old and New Testaments.
And Thomas Aquinas, to me, does that historically. If you want to look in the move, and you're talking geographically, when I think theologically and historically, by the time you get to Aquinas, 11th century, he'll say God, and everyone knows that's Yahweh. And from there on, we never, from what this is a bold statement, Mike, and then I'll let you get back into your point. Sorry for cutting you off, but this is so interesting to me. Between Aquinas and Heiser, basically, nobody stopped and said, wait a second, which God are you talking about? It just wasn't part of my training. It wasn't part of yours, probably. I'd say anyone who went to seminary in the 60s through the 90s, you never heard that conversation. And I'm saying that's where Mike made his point, and that's where we sit today in that shadow. But it all started with Aquinas to me. And anyway, I cut you off. Apologize.
No, it's okay. But that's what it actually lends into what I mean about how Western Christianity itself, when you look at the differences between Western and Eastern Christianity's experiences, Western Christianity experienced essentially a support by the culture in majority. I know some people would say, well, what do you mean that Christianity won? What I technically mean is it won the thought battle. It won the philosophical battle. And by the time you get to a person like Aquinas, like you're mentioning, he's building on the shoulders of other theologians and philosophers before him, like Augustine, who was moving away from a very spiritual, supernatural worldview to a more and more materialistic and more, concrete, physical type of worldview.
A philosophical worldview, I'd call it.
Yeah. And so you have that essentially where you get to a point where pretty much in European Western civilization on a larger scale, they weren't thinking on, big assumptions that when you use the word God, that you're talking about anyone else besides the God of Israel. Right? Because in their minds and from their whole upbringing, they were only really ever exposed to this God that's described by their priests, by their fathers, by the monks and the sisters that they would meet in the monasteries, that this is the God that they're all talking about. And so in some sense, Christianity in the West had won that major thought battle. And especially once we get into the Enlightenment era, into the time when more and more people become uncomfortable with spiritual stuff, but you have Christians who are being brought up in an Enlightenment era society, still then trying to hold on to certain supernatural things, and thus the word God even becomes even more focused on just the God of Israel and Jesus the Christ and so on and so forth. It's not only now, it's so ironically in Western society that the resurgence of paganism and neo-paganism and other types of worship and other religions coming into places like the United States, that now when we say the word God, we cannot assume that we're talking about the God of Israel, right? And I'm not sure if that's necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, And
it's just simply Christianity had just gotten so used to, Western Christianity has gotten so used to controlling the conversation and its usage of vocabulary that it's shocking now for some people.
Yeah, I would say, and we're recording this around the time of the inauguration of Donald Trump, his 47th, or his new inauguration here, and I was struck by this, that if I was an alien watching this inauguration, I would say, based on the language used, prayers were said, songs were sung, "Great is Thy faithfulness" was sung. I mean, played, whatever. And prayers were said, Franklin Graham, that the national God of the Americans is Yahweh. I would have thought that based on how the word God was used and the context of that. And it's just not any God. In other words, they have their hand on a Bible, and that's the Jewish Christian, book. So my guess would be, if I was watching that with no context, I would say Yahweh is America's deity based on how we treated him. Now, that does not mean all Americans go to heaven. We've never, maintained that. We're just saying that as a nation, we put ourselves under supposedly the rule of this deity. And yet at the same time, I bring this up because I'm not saying by any stretch that anyone in that room necessarily, whether, in the rotunda or watching, cared one lick about Yahweh. I mean, I'm sure many did. And I don't want to demean the Christianity of many good Christians there. I'm just saying that you can have a national deity and the individuals can ignore it, right? And that's kind of the story of Israel, that Joash, believed in Yahweh, but that doesn't mean all the people out in the villages of, outside of Jerusalem cared at all. So anyway, I'll have to move on, but it's interesting how the word God is thrown around even at an inauguration. And we presume, what the word means, but you're right. There's a lot of mental baggage and furniture that we need when we go to the Bible. We have to unpack it much better. So
yeah,
I'm ready for number 5. So here we get moving into a New Testament thinking. Number 5, thus in the end. This is what a divine council worldview, some call it a Deuteronomy 32 worldview, means. And my definition, in other words, my personal definition of a divine council worldview, it does not demand that Yahweh sits among, listen to my words now, a council of decision-making gods. I know this is where the story or the word divine council sometimes throws people off, as though God actually sits in a board meeting, with a big table and there's God sitting around in different chairs. No, the word council, again, in Hebrew just means gathering or group. So all we're saying is we're simply affirming in a divine council worldview, this is my personal way of saying it, that Yahweh, the creator Elohim, has chosen to conduct his rule over the world through the agency of a host of created and active Elohim. That separates us from a non-divine council worldview. In other words, if you say it that way, Yahweh has chosen to conduct his rule over the world through the agency of a host of active Elohim. Now, as soon as you say that, bingo, that's a divine council worldview to me. And then that's what's really, as you've heard people, whether it's through Mike Kaiser or through any reading they've done since then, what has helped people is a divine council worldview in how it clarifies many biblical passages that often are left to languish in uncertainty, or shall we call it ignorance or disregard. People don't even want to talk about those passages because they're weird or hard. And wouldn't you know, a divine council worldview comes along and satisfies the interested Bible reader, because it now has answers for some of those very difficult passages. So again, we've been through all this, but I use this as a kind of a, get us all in the same room now. Are we ready to move into a read of John with this in mind? Because all we have to do is get to John 1:1, our next podcast, and the lid comes off right away. All of a sudden we realize we are neck deep in divine council worldview issues, and we haven't even gotten past the first verse of John 1. So that's why I've taken the time to go this far into a review of where we're coming. So anything you want to add before I move on?
I mean, I think this it lends back into what we were just talking about regarding like Western society and Western Christianity. And, it's kind of funny. Sometimes I think, because there are, words that sound alike, sometimes folks will hear divine counsel worldview, and the immediate response that I've seen is God does not need a counselor.
Right. Yeah.
Because they don't think of counsel as COUNCIL. They think of, counseling or
SEL. Yeah.
And like, no, that's not what we're saying. And we also we're so divorced from the concept of a king, and of a king with his entourage, his throne room, his advisors, of having the people around him giving him insights and information so that he can make a decision. And so that's generally the way that I would think of it, that yes, indeed, the divine counsel worldview, all that we're simply saying is there is this gathering of these other created beings that God had made, who he invites to be involved with the conduct of the world. But he, in the end, is still the sovereign. He is the one that ultimately makes the decisions. And he welcomes the opinions and ideas, and he invites that participation. But they are not going to be the ones making the final call of what needs to be said or done. And so I think that's just something that folks at times need to kind of be aware of, is that we are living in a very different time where individual rights and individual voting, your individual say, is super important. But in the context of the Old Testament and with this divine counsel worldview, the one who makes the final decisions ultimately is always going to be Yahweh.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. Good to clarify. All right, we're getting close now to moving. Well, now we do move into the New Testament. As the Old Testament, and you have to think through this again lexically, as the Old Testament undergoes translation into later cultures, and the Old Testament is translated through there's four basic Hebrew to other language translations in the ancient world. The most commonly known, or the most popular, is the LXX, or the Septuagint, translating the Old Testament into Greek. The Targums were translating the Old Testament into Aramaic, 4th and 5th century BC, or 2nd and 3rd century BC, basically. The Peshitta is the Syriac version of the Old Testament, again, 3rd and 4th century AD at this point. And the Vulgate, Jerome, translated directly the Old Testament into Latin in 300 and some AD. So there are four major translations of the Old Testament. Again, the one we're concerned about here for John next time is the Septuagint. And the challenge will be translating Elohim into the new language of Greek. And here's the point. We would not assume this to be an easy task, because as anyone who knows languages is aware, it's very strange, very uncommon for a word to move between, especially a word that is fraught with meaning, to move between languages easily. So we should not be surprised, here's my point, to find that Elohim does not have a one-to-one correspondence with any Greek word. We shouldn't assume that. In other words, if it happens, fine, but we shouldn't assume going in that an Elohim is a blank. That just wouldn't work, because, again, of how language or translations generally work. So during the translation of the Septuagint, it's interesting how the word Elohim, or Theos, frankly, in Greek, does not work as a direct, straight move across from Elohim. Two quick examples, by the way, which is not directly our point here, but it was an entire chapter of my dissertation when I was going through this kind of stuff, was that in the move from Hebrew to Greek, Hebrew Old Testament, Greek Septuagint, there were times that the translators, and let's admit that the Septuagint can be very paraphrastic at times, very unliteral. Like in Job 1:6, there was a day when the B'nai Elohim came to present themselves. And they clearly are spirits. They're divine beings, sons of the gods, or sons of God, meaning divine class beings. So you could read it that way. Now, there was a day when divine class beings came to present themselves, Satan being among them. The Septuagint, when it comes to that, it doesn't even say sons of God. It goes with the Greek word angelos. Now, again, angelos, we think angel. Don't do that. Angel doesn't happen until the 13th century AD when English is invented, or shall we say, or English, is starting to be a common language. The word angelos is their translation in Greek of the Hebrew bene. So what are they doing there? They're trying to say those beings that are godlike and messaging for him. Something like that is coming out in the Septuagint version of Job 1:6. Even more specific to me in my as I watch Old Testament turn into the New is Psalm 8:5. You have made him, man, a little lower than Elohim, reads the Hebrew. Mankind's made lower than Elohim. In the Septuagint, they just go right straight to angelos, that God made us lower than angeloi. And again, that does not mean angel. It means messenger beings who, Elohim, who are on the move for Yahweh. We're made even below them. So there's a lot going on, shall we say, theologically there, but even more so technically or linguistically that we should be aware of, so that when we move now into John, and getting close to that now, we have more work to do. So,
I mean, Ron, I've always kind of wanted to maybe bring this up. I guess I will bring it up here at this moment.
So you will, yes.
But I understand, I get it, especially when we did a little bit of the word history of the word angelos in the beginning episodes of our podcast. But I also do understand that language does evolve, right? It's not a static thing. Language and word usage and the primary definitions that people think of, or the associations with certain words that people think of, those over time do change from one generation to another, right? Like even certain, like even this past Christmas season, there are certain Christmas songs that I can think of that uses a certain word that meant happy for when it was written back then. But for us, when we hear that word in isolation, we think of something completely different on a completely different topic. And so I do wonder, a little bit of what happens when we're seeing this move from Hebrew into Greek is, as much as we may not like it, that even the word angelos starts, even though it was originally meant to be a job title, that the job title slowly morphed into, in the most common layperson way of thinking, in their matrix of ideas. I'm talking about divine beings because, yes, this could technically be a messenger and it could be divine or human. But if I'm reading a religious text, if I'm reading something that's giving spiritual stuff or religious stuff or supernatural stuff, then when I see the word angelos or hear the word angelos, I already know what you're talking about. And so I can kind of see like the mental shortcuts that are happening just from that transition from Hebrew into Greek, of that angeloi here is not just translating bene, but they're combining the whole thing of bene Elohim into angeloi toi theo.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And I guess that's just what I'm wondering about, is that we still have to observe that there is a slow change of usage of language, right? And
so that by the time you get to Hebrews, is it 2:5, that God has not put the future world into the hands of angels. Well, that's how it reads in English. But again, think in terms of their language. He's talking about a divine council worldview getting upset, as it were. The world to come will not be put in the hands of angeloi.
Yeah.
Meaning these sons of God who, and then now go back to Job 1:6, that's the group that's coming in front of Yahweh. So Hebrews 2:5 is referring to Job 1:6 and using the same Greek word, and again, missing or not trying to make us think of angels, that's for sure. So.
Yeah, I think we just have to be cautious, right? Because sometimes, like we can definitely get on our academic, high chairs and get upset. But I think there is still always this awareness that language is, even in the midst of studying Second Temple materials, there's a shifting and changing. And even here, like I had some articles that I saw in DDD that mentioned about how the word theos is generally used. But it's specifically used in Jewish context in a vastly different way, right? And even within the Jewish community, they're co-opting Greek, but they're utilizing it in their particular cultural context to mean what, they're trying to translate from Hebrew and Aramaic into Greek wordage.
It's a clash of language and culture. Yeah, you're right. In the New Testament or the first century, the Second Temple literature material, you're having Jewish, Greek, and Roman thought patterns clashing. And what word do you want to choose to either get along with the culture you're in or challenge the culture you're in is going to be a good issue. So.
And like one example if I can provide is even just from my own cultural like background is like my family technically I'm Toisanese. I'm part of an ethnic group that's originally from like the villages of China, but Toisanese is a very minor dialect of Chinese, and in southern China, the more popular one that typically everyone has heard of is Cantonese. And so one word I've noticed that has been co-opted both by English speakers and Chinese Mandarin speakers who are speaking to an English audience is that they would use the word bok choy. And that word is simply just means green vegetables, but it's used to describe a particular Chinese vegetable that's in Chinese grocery markets. And now you can find it pretty much in every, even American supermarkets, because it's used so often in Chinese cooking.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, it means something different now to me than it would to you or to
and so
parents.
I hear the word bok choy as a kid, and I'm thinking about every type of green vegetable out there. But then I start seeing it in TV, and I'm seeing American speakers, white, black, Hispanic, whoever, and they're using, I'm going to bring in some bok choy into this. And then I'm seeing some Chinese cooks who I know are Mandarin speakers. And in Mandarin, they have their own version of bok choy in Mandarin. But they will still also use the word bok choy. So they're technically speaking Cantonese at that moment, but they're using a word that has essentially gone from Cantonese and transliterated into English. And then a Mandarin speaker is now using the Cantonese pronunciation of the word that they would have used in Mandarin themselves. So it's just funny to me, right? Of just seeing even just how that, so when I see the word angelos, I get it. At the same time though, I'm just like, human beings are very good at creating shortcuts, mental shortcuts, just because we're trying to optimize. And if I understand the context of what this text that I'm reading and that is coming from this community, I can see why they would just start shortening things down to angeloi instead of the sons of gods or or messengers, but divine messengers, supernatural. Like they want to try to simplify it. And so that's all I just simply wanted to bring up. I get it. Like when we're trying to be very specific and trying to clarify a divine council worldview, we have to make a big deal about it.
I have it somewhere in my files. I forget where. I have not found it in the last couple of months when I've gone looking. I have a photocopy of, is it Sinaiticus or Alexandrinus, one of the oldest copies of the Old Testament. And it has, you can tell that they, in Genesis 1 and 2 and 3, the sons of God came into the daughters of men. They erased or crossed out, and you can see the word angelos written in on the copy of Sinaiticus, as though even then they were already flipping back and forth between Hebrew, sons of God, and Malach, or I forget, is Sinaiticus in Greek? I'm thinking it is now.
Yeah, I think Sinaiticus.
It was angelos, I believe. So yeah, it is. And so you're already feeling this out even in Genesis 6. So, or even in the story of Genesis 6. All right, I'm ready for number 7. The word Elohim. This is interesting to me. The word Elohim occurs 2,600 times in the Hebrew Bible. By far the most common translation of this word when you get into the Greek Septuagint is Theos, Theos. It's interesting, though, if you look up Theos in your Septuagint, it occurs 3,500 times, indicating that these two words are not the same thing exactly. So God or divine being may not be identical in meaning when comparing the Semitic world of Elohim and the Greco-Roman world of Theos. There's 900 moments or times when the word Theos is put in the Septuagint that the word Elohim is not there. So even statistically, it shows that an Elohim may not necessarily be a Theos or vice versa. So I'm just throwing this in as a, by the way, here's the statistics that prove even that they were not thinking a one-to-one correspondence between the two. If you look up, yep.
I'm curious, Ron, is that just with the word Elohim itself, or is that also with some of the related other words like El or Elah?
I don't know. I'd have to check my source on that one.
Because I can see Elohim, yes, like it would be less than the number of times a Theos. I'm just curious because
well, what happens? Actually, I can answer that better this way. There are times that Theos will stand in for the Tetragrammaton. That they'll just take the word Yahweh and put Theos there in Greek. So that's not uncommon. So I'm trying to think of some other examples, but the point is that Elohim isn't always a one-to-one. And sometimes Theos will be what the translator, a loose translation version of something, will presume that that's a divine being there they're talking about, even if it's Yahweh. Mm-hmm. So, all right, lexically, if you just look up the word Theos in BDAG, Bauer, Donker, Art, and Gingrich, our standard lexicon today, Greek English lexicon that's still being used, here's what you get. This is the definition, or definition number 1 under Theos. Primarily refers to a transcendent being who exercises extraordinary control in human affairs or is responsible for bestowal of unusual benefits, a deity, a god, a goddess. So there, and again, these are made up definitions based on years of work, right? We're not getting this from the sky. No one yells down, here's what a Theos is. We have to figure this out the way it's used in our Greek literature. We notice initially that this definition does not set out to describe the where question when it comes to where that being lives or abides. It's transcendent, but does it always exist above us? Like the Elohim concept seems to have been more of a where it resides idea, and it was just the title for anything that's not human in that sense. And in this sense, the Greek and Romans, men and theoi may not be completely two separate issues or two separate kinds of being. Men and in other words, and here's where now the amount of books and the amount of reading can overwhelm you. And this is, again, my world, where you get into Roman emperors. 36 of the 60 Roman emperors were divinized, either during or shortly after their lifetime, by the Senate. The Roman Senate would vote and say, yes, Tiberius is a deity. Well, all of a sudden you realize, and again, there's no voting in the Old Testament as to whether Moses is an Elohim, but in the New Testament time period, in the Greco-Roman world into which the Bible is, or Jesus comes, you have Theos being applied to humans much more commonly, or demigods, or what was assumed to live between the world of gods, officially, and humans. So daemons in Greek, that kind of thing. Even angeloi. The concept of Theos is just much more fluid, is my point, and it just doesn't have a one-to-one correspondence with Elohim as much as we wish it did.
Can I bring in a little bit of what I mentioned earlier about from DDD? Yeah. So this is under their entries. They have 2 entries for God, one dealing with Elohim and the other one that deals with the word Theos. And so it's interesting here. One of the entries mentions in pagan Greek literature, the use of the word Theos is markedly different from what we find in the Bible. The difference is not only that Theos is applied by the Greeks to a plurality of divine personal beings, but also that often the word is used for human beings and impersonal objects and even abstract concepts that would not readily be called Theos or Theoi in the monotheistic Judeo-Christian tradition. Mm-hmm. And the same applies to the use of deus in pagan Latin literature. And they basically go on to show other examples of how the word theos and theoi in Greek literature essentially are used to describe non-human phenomenon, or like tornadoes or giant windstorms, earthquakes, like something that is beyond the power of a normal human being, and even like non-personal concepts and events. And so the word had a lot of stretch in meaning. And when we consider what's going on within like pagan religion, pagan mythology stories that they had, you have heroes such as Hercules, who is a mix of Zeus is his dad and he had a human mother, but he was a human being, but who had extra long life, had extra human strength. Like there was this way where the world of the gods and humans interacted so much more on a ground level that in some sense, I could see why the word theos incorporated, well, we're just going to include everything that's just supernatural and just beyond human capability. Just because that was just the literary and just kind of mythical world that the Greeks and the Romans lived in. And so they're using a word that incorporated all those concepts.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Here is a quote from Michael Bird. This is my favorite lately. Michael Bird down in Australia, wonderful writer, theologian. Anything he writes, I try to get my hands on. Mm-hmm. And he has recently come out with Jesus Among the Gods, early Christology in the Greco-Roman world. And he does a great job in just overviewing the history of it and then gets into his own view. But here's a quotation. Christian theology was immersed in the philosophical currents of the ancient world with its conception of how the divine and terrestrial realms interfaced. Greco-Roman philosophy had its own theologies about the nature of divinity, and you brought this up, Mike, the divinity of nature. Discussion encompassed God, singular, capital G, and gods, plural, their bodies, abode, and interest or not, in the affairs of human beings. Greco-Roman categories for divine nature, dialogues about a demiurge, descriptions of demons, and state rituals for deification are the environment in which discourses about Jesus' deity crystallized. In other words, if we really want to be serious about the conversation of what it means for Jesus to be deity, we have to, and this is fun. I mean, we shouldn't get discouraged when we realize that I've now got to throw my mind and interest into an entire worldview that is 2,000 years ago and start reading about how the emperors were thought to be deified, or how, as you brought up, forces of nature were sometimes deified. Or, and this is Paul, the elements, what's stoicheia in Galatians 4. I take those to be the gods that were, placed over human affairs. And Paul calls them stoicheia because they are elemental deities, as it were, the ones that the people out in the villages worship when it rains, things like that. So anyway, that's just an interesting and helpful quote.
Interesting anecdote about Dr. Bird. I got to meet him at ETS last year. Not this past ETS, but 2 years ago, the one that you were able to attend last time. And got to talking with him about Dr. Heiser, because he was on Dr. Heiser's podcast once to do an interview on his evangelical theology book. And yeah, he had fond memories of Mike. And I'm also subscribed to Dr. Bird's Substack, because he writes these articles, like essentially it's like professional blog type of platform. Right. And it's interesting. He's been exploring. So he recently, after he wrote that work that you just quoted him from, he wrote, co-authored with N.T. Wright, Jesus and the Powers. So it's kind of dealing with that interesting set of passages from Paul about the powers and principalities. And then on his own Substack, he's been exploring and talking about First Enoch. And so it's interesting to see that even though he's primarily a Greek New Testament scholar, he's been diving into Second Temple literature and just getting into that thought world as well. And it's been encouraging to see that he recognizes that this time that we typically call the Second Temple period was a wild, wild west of ideas. And it was just a lot of stuff that was being incorporated. And, that the church was in competition with, was it really trying to clarify and crystallize its ideas in a way to promote the worship of Yahweh and the worship of Jesus.
And thank you. What I'm trying to get away from, you might be hearing it in the, between the lines of my discussion here, is that, well, if I'm going to read the New Testament and Jesus was predicted in the Old, I'm going to just simply read New Testament with Old Testament ideas, and there I'm going to make Jesus an Elohim. See what I'm doing? If I can, if Yahweh is an Elohim and the Old Testament is predicting Jesus, I get to just slide the word Elohim into the New Testament and place it on Jesus, and I create my Christology based on the word Elohim. What I'm recommending is not that. I'm saying we have to respect the world that Paul and Jesus lived in, where the word Theos was the coined word for divine being, and it did not mean Elohim. In other words, there's just different meanings to this word, so it becomes a bit more challenging. So I'm ready for number 9. Mm-hmm. It stands to reason then that describing Jesus, now here's where I'm sticking my neck out, okay, Mike, and I talk about, I hope you heard me before, so you don't get offended by what I say now, kind of a thing for the listener. It stands to reason then that describing Jesus as a theos in the Greek language would not mean the same thing as describing Jesus as God in our modern English usage of the term, capital G. As much as we might desire otherwise, Theos and God, capital G, simply do not mean the same thing. Describing the nature of Christ should, here's my opinion, should limit itself to the Bible as much as possible, avoiding such terms as, and here we go, God, truly God, fully divine. I mean, there's all sorts of phrases that when I read books, and I've got them by the dozens, on the personality and the work and the nature of Jesus, and I love them. I mean, I want to know, like everyone else, who Jesus is, right? But when I see an author use a term fully God, capital G, I tune him out. I say, well, that's not what the word, there is no Greek term for fully God. I mean, I know where you're trying to go, but that's not the words the Bible uses. So why did you invent an English phrase that has no meaning in Greek? That's where I'm frustrated. Maybe the word frustrated is too strong, but I know when I'm doing academic work and I hear an author and I'm reading an academic work, let's say, and then I come across this phrase, fully God, I just I do what my 3-year-old granddaughter does when she doesn't like something. She just kind of droops her shoulders, and well, enough. But you see where I'm going with that?
I do, but at the same time, I go back to what I was mentioning earlier about how even the word angeloi, over time, the semantic range and just the mental shortcuts that people have done, they start taking over. It becomes easier, especially if you know constantly, like, okay, this is my general audience, and the people that I'm amongst. We're like, this is our insider language that we're building.
Okay, insider language. I'm fair with that. But that's what bothers me is that if I say, let's say I'm in front of an audience and I say, Jesus is fully God, I know what they think I mean. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yep.
But why did I have to use a phrase the Bible knows nothing about? I'm fully Theos. Satan is fully Theos. Fair enough, Mike? Would you agree with me? Satan is fully Theos. 2 Corinthians 4:4.
See, he's fully Theos in the technicality if we mean Theos as like a supernatural being.
Right. So what did I mean by fully God when I said Jesus? I'm trying to speak Trinitarianly. Because Satan's fully Theos, but he's not Trinitarian.
Yeah.
So
I do understand like the frustration. But see, this is always kind of the funny thing about, persons like you and me, Ron, is that we have our feet planted in two major different like cultures and arenas, right?
Right.
We're immersed in our reading and in our research and our hobby time in essentially academic works where folks are really trying to get into the nitty gritty. They're trying to really fully flesh out. I didn't mean to use fully as an ironic way, but to use that to just try to like really just dig down into that well and bring out everything from inside this cistern, right? And just immerse our minds into like, okay, let's try to get some clarity, like some really true crystal clarity.
Yeah.
But then we also come from a world where we're just simply trying to teach people to love God and to love others around them and to love their neighbor. And they're not immersed in that academic world where people drill 50 feet down to get a diamond.
Here, but let me say it this way: as we're getting close to wrapping up this episode, and the next episode we're going to go to John 1:1. You don't, and what I'm going to say, you agree with. I know you're going to agree with this. So here we go. You don't, because Mike said it many times. You don't have to be an academic to understand this. It's not that hard. So here's what I'm recommending. Let's move from this conversation into John 1:1 and let the text tell us who Jesus is. And we don't have to say fully God, because the text won't. We're going to call Jesus what the text calls him, and we're going to go, wow, that's cool. But we're not going to shortcut the conversation and put a capital G on Jesus. You don't have to do that. And you don't have to become an academic to do it either. So anyway, that's an advertisement for next podcast. So hang with it. I've got 2 more points and we can call it a day. Number 10, listening to first century descriptions of Jesus' nature bears interesting results. Again, sticking my neck out. Less important, or at least less controversial, was the application of the word theos to Jesus. This is because multiple theoi, as we just mentioned about Satan, for example, were understood to exist in the heavens and make frequent appearances on earth. Remember Acts 14, Acts 28, Paul is twice mistakenly thought to be a theos. Moses was never mistaken to be an Elohim. Paul, of all people, was mistaken for a theos because of something he did or what happened to him, So my point is, much more important and much more controversial in the New Testament was Jesus' described relationship to Yahweh. That's what's going to get him into trouble. Yahweh, the Theos of Israel. How did Jesus see himself in relation to his Father, God the Father, or Theos the Father, as he'll even call him in John several times. So whether it's in the opinion of people hearing Jesus or people following Jesus or even Jesus himself, what's going to get Jesus to have heads turned will not be, hey, I'm a Theos. Well, they have those every now and then anyway. No, what's going to get people's heads turned is when he says, I and the Father are one. Now they have, and we'll talk about that in John 10. We have a ways to go to get there. But the point is, whether Jesus is Theos or not, to me, is not really a issue that theologically you need to, put your flag in the ground and say, I'm not moving. Well, to them, it didn't have a lot of oomph to it to say Jesus was a Theos. I mean, comparatively. Sure. So, yeah. All right. Last point. It is in number 11 in my list. It is in turning to a book like John, next time, that Jesus' relationship to the Theos of Israel becomes the issue of conversation. And his followers, I think, were trying to figure this out happily. They weren't opposed to it. And controversy. This is where the Pharisees will get up in arms because Jesus claims to be one with the Father, right? So up front, we're told, here's coming up next time, 1:1. Jesus was with the Theos and even was Theos, John 1:1. And then what's interesting in 1:18, which we're not going to handle next time because it's, again, 18 verses in, but then it will say, no one has seen Theos at any time. Meanwhile, Jesus is a visible manifestation as a unique Theos. So what's going on there? In 5:44, he'll talk of the only Theos as being, quote, the Father who set his seal on him, 6:27. And then again, as we've said, he'll turn around and claim to be one with his Father in 10:30. So it's just a fun book to, I hope that I've interested the listener to come back and now get into John and the reason this hour was important was because Theos will be right up front, John 1:1, and if you had not heard this podcast, next time is going to throw you for what I'm recommending next time is going to be, it's going to sound weird, but that's because we haven't thought through, what a theos is. So hopefully this hour has been helpful in just getting us ready to deal with the Greek text where it was in its worldview, as a DCW model necessitates. Here's where reading John with a DCW is necessarily different. You're going to be going into the book realizing plural theoi exist in the mind of not only the people, but Jesus himself. He knows that plural theoi are very real. And so for him to say, I'm a theos, again, notice how that's not going to have the same meaning as when we say he's God and we put a capital G on it. So anyway, I'm all done. If you are, Mike, what is there any final thoughts as we wrap it up? Again, please come back next time. And we'll drop into John 1:1 with this conversation in tow, in mind, as we go.
I guess just to close off, we are getting close to 52 episodes for our podcast. And that's a year's worth of podcasting between you, me, Mel, and Rich. Yeah. And so if anything, we've been asking our audience, if you guys have any questions that you want to ask us, information will be in the posting on this episode. So you can email some questions to us. We want to do a special kind of episode to just commemorate what it's been like podcasting for a year and just working with one another and being part of the Mike Heiser Foundation. So thank you guys for your support. The fact that
a good
Ron
advertisement. Again, we should always mention, if you want to support this podcast, the way to do it is to join the DRMSH community, drmsh.com, or is it miclot.com? I'm forgetting the address. Help me.
drmsh.com. And there's a link to the private community that Dr. Heiser had created before his passing.
There we go. And that's the community that supports this podcast. So, All right. Thank you, everyone. Until next time, use this as the jumping, the springboard for next time in John 1. And until then, we'll see you then. And until then, God bless.